Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Eileen Chevalier and we are learning about botany today. We are going to learn about reproduction in plants. All living things must reproduce in order for their species to survive. In this lesson, we'll compare two main ways that angiospermae create new flowering plants: vegetative and sexual reproduction. So you're going to only need a couple things today. You need your journal, of course, your flashcards, and the DK Ultimate Visual Dictionary. The pages that we're going to look at are 144 through 155. And I'm just going to take you through those really quickly. This book is amazing. I really hope that you have it. If not, I just want to give you a brief overview of the kinds of topics that they have, and then you'll want to go and get it. All right, so pollination. This is what's happening in sexual reproduction. Down here, there are all these close-ups of pollen grains, which is super fascinating. And then they're showing you how the sexual parts of the flower work. So this is the female right here. And the female has three main parts. So we have the stigma is on the end. The style connects the stigma to the ovary, which is down at the bottom. And then the male parts, the whole thing is called the stamen. Multiples are called stamens, or more correctly, stamina. So at the end we have an anther that has pollen, and then this long piece that connects it to the base is the filament. And then the next page is fertilization, this is just one of the best pages in this book. It's so fascinating. We're going to use all these little diagrams over here for one of our journal activities, just so you can see what's really going on close up in fertilization. These are the fruits. We'll talk more about fruits in a different lesson, but just to give you a teaser for the future. So those were succulent fruits. So succulent fruits, they're like juicy. A lot of times we think they're delicious. Dry fruits, not so much, with a couple exceptions. So dry fruits, when we talk about a fruit, it really has to do with the ovary, which is at the base of the female part of the plant. You'll notice that strawberries are on here. We'll talk more about that later. They are technically a dry fruit because they're definitely not berries. And then this page is fantastic. This is germination. And it goes and takes you through what all the different parts of the seed are, and as it grows, what's happening and what those specific parts are called. If you remember from the germination video, we talked about a seed is sleepy. So this is another really great page to kind of explain like a little more technically what those terms are. And then finally, so all of that was sexual reproduction. And then there's really only 2 pages on vegetative reproduction, which is my favorite, which is right here. So this is how I usually propagate my own plants. And there's a video that I did where I'm propagating some succulents. You can go and watch that. But we'll talk more about vegetative in one lesson, and we'll do sexual in one lesson. But in this lesson, we're just going to compare the 2 different types. All right, go ahead and get out your journal and I'll read the definitions for today for you. Reproduction: creation of new living organisms using cells and genetic material from 1 or 2 existing organisms. DNA: deoxyribonucleic acid. A string of genetic information that determines the appearance and function of each living thing. So what's really interesting about DNA is that technically we are told that it determines how things look and how they work. But really, you can look at studies of twins, so DNA only does so much. There's so many other factors, and as we live and exist in the world, and as plants live and exist in the world, all of the environmental factors that they experience affect them, and then the DNA can manifest different characteristics. So It does technically determine, like it determines the range of the adaptations that a plant can have, or a human can have, or any living thing can have. But it doesn't mean that there's only one manifestation, so there can be multiple manifestations with the same DNA. All right, we'll go on to a question and investigate. Some plants are masters of reproducing sexually. Have you ever seen dandelions pop up all over a yard that only had a few plants the year before? Other plants are masters of reproducing vegetatively. Have you planted a hosta or daylily and watched each year as more and more plants emerge in the spring? What makes a plant good at reproducing in one way or another? Is it possible for the same plant to reproduce vegetatively in one environment and sexually in another, and why? Why would that work? So with dandelions, how does it work? Like, we see them in the spring and they get all crazy, but are they underground just kind of waiting, or do they need to rely on those seeds? And they have so many seeds. Hey, if you listen to the inflorescence lesson, then you can probably figure out, because think about a dandelion and all of those little seeds. Those are all dry fruits on there. And they have a little parachutey thing, and you blow them, they all separate. So every single one of those is a seed, but it's just all on the single head of the dandelion. So if it's on the head of the dandelion, then it's the capitulum and fluorescence. So capitulum and fluorescence allows it to make so many seeds from the same flower. All the florets are on there. So sometimes, and in certain environments, especially if you've taken a plant out of where it's native to, there's a relationship between the pollinators for a plant and the plant itself. So the pollinators need more than just that plant. They need a lot of other things in their environment to survive and live and thrive, not just the nectar from that plant when it's blooming. So if you take a plant that's native to one area and you plant it into another area, it may not have the necessary pollinators to make sure that it's going to be able to make seed. So then it would really need to be able to reproduce vegetatively so that there can be more and more of them. That would be its only option if it doesn't have pollinators for its seeds, unless, of course, it's self-pollinating, and then it will be fine. But if it's relying on a pollinator, it doesn't have any choice but to reproduce vegetatively. So let me just clarify. I'm so sorry. I should have probably done this before. So I showed you the picture of the pistil and the stamen on the first page, and that is how sexual reproduction works. It's two parents. But then vegetative reproduction is just from the vegetative part of the plant. So it's everything that you see here, right? It's just a vegetative part of the plant. It's the non-flower parts of the plant. So when someone tells you eat your vegetables, what they probably mean is eat your fruits and vegetables, because most of the things that you're eating are actually fruits. Like a cucumber is a fruit, and squash is a fruit, and peppers are fruits. So, but the vegetables, or the vegetative part, is actually the roots, stems, and leaves. And anytime you take a root, part of a root, a stem, or a leaf, and you use that to create a new plant, you are reproducing that plant vegetatively. Plants do this for themselves all the time. Lots of plants, if you've ever seen wild strawberries, so they'll have like their little plant, and then they'll send this really long, it's called a stolon, or I might not be pronouncing that correctly, that's how I say it. And then it's like this long stem, and the point of that stem is to make a new plant. So then when it gets really long, then it'll put out new leaves on there, and it'll start sending down some adventitious roots in the hope that it can plant itself there. And then once that plant is established, it does the same thing. So it just creates this web of, not a web, but you know what I mean, new plants, because it's sending them out. So it's keeping the nourishment from the parent to keep it alive long enough to survive on its own. And then that plant can do the same thing in the future. So that's a great way for it to reproduce vegetatively. Next question. Do all daughter plants from a single parent plant contain the same DNA? Many seeds contain genetic material from two different plants, but some plants are self-fertilizing and seeds are created from a single parent plant. In vegetative production, daughter plants have the same DNA as the single parent plant. Is it true of daughter plants created sexually, meaning they have seeds from a single parent plant? Why? And is this always true? Let's say you have a plant that was growing in the wild, and you have all of these different plants that can pollinate one another. And so this one over here pollinates this one. So there's a cross-pollination that happens. And then the next year, this plant, because a lot of plants can reproduce both with cross-pollination and with self-fertilization, right? So bees can come over from a different plant, and then that can mix the DNA, or the bee can just be on top of that plant, and the pollen from the plant itself goes onto its own pistil. So that's self-fertilization. So the pollen comes from the same plant that the seeds are created in. So one year it comes from a different plant, and then the seeds that are created, that has the DNA of two different parents. And so then that seed grows up the next year and it pollinates itself. And because it had these two different parents, it has different recessives, right? So you've probably seen redheaded kids whose parents didn't have red hair. You're like, how do you have red hair? Because your parents don't have red hair and you got to look like your parents and they just pass their genes on. But really these things are recessive, right? So these could be genes that are hiding, and then when you get two of the hiding ones together, then it becomes prominent, right? So the DNA can be different based on which parts of the DNA are coming off. So every time you split the DNA and you only get half of the DNA, you're only getting certain halves of it. And then how it mixes change depending on which halves of the DNA they got. So this one right here, and I don't know if you remember this from the lesson before, but if these are bred together, then they look like this. And if these are bred together, then they look like all of these. Because they came from two different parents, they have different recessives in there, and the recessives start showing up differently. But really, how did Gregor Mendel figure that out? He just did over and over after years, because he's doing peas, right? So you have to wait for it to mature, and then you have to plant those seeds, and then wait for them to mature, and then plant another round. So he did this over the course of years, and he did lots of experiments with lots of different kinds of plants to understand what was happening with the genetics, because at that time, no one could sequence DNA. You just had to do an experiment, which you too can do at home. All right, there's a lot more to learn about that, so do some more research. And for your journal activity, there's only one for today, but it's kind of a biggie, and it's something that I'd like for you to use in the future lessons as well. So make a chart of the two ways that angiospermae reproduce, vegetative and sexual. Compare the following. How many parent plants are needed? Will the new plant have unique DNA or the same DNA? And if it can do both, then just mark that it can do both. And if it can have, if even if it's reproducing sexually, can it have only one parent? If it's self-fertilized, so you need to write that. So if you have in that section for sexual reproduction, you can say self-fertile 1, and then you can say cross-pollinated 2. So it can have 1 or 2 parents. Not every plant can do that, but it is possible within sexual reproduction that you could have 1 or 2 parents. And what conditions are necessary for each type of reproduction to occur. And then make sure you leave space, because we're going to add to this in the next couple lessons. And like there's some specific things, and then some things that you'll just find interesting as you go along. Is it easier for me to propagate plants using vegetative reproduction or sexual reproduction? Maybe it depends on the plant, right? So like some plants are really easy to reproduce for me to propagate sexually. It's like I've done cilantro. Cilantro is really easy. It's so prolific. There's so many seeds from cilantro, and you just like plant them. You can plant them within the same year. However, jade is really hard. So this is jade. I've never been able to propagate a jade using seeds. I've only had one in like 20 years actually bloom. So I didn't even know how to collect seeds or anything. It probably didn't even get pollinated. I have no idea. But I have made so many jade babies from my original jade. This is one of the babies. So vegetative reproduction is extremely prolific for certain types of plants in certain conditions, right? So like I live in North Carolina right now, and that is not where jades are native. So I needed to reproduce it vegetatively. So some of those questions are a little tricky and they just depend. So write that in your notes too. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. We'll go into this more in depth in the future lessons. I'll see you there.